The rules of the Orthus 9 survival trial were revealed at dawn when the dense silver fog still clung to the mossy ground and the alien cadets huddled together in uneasy silence. The instructor, a tall insectoid officer with a vibrating crest, announced the restrictions with a tone that made even the veterans flinch. No tools of any kind, no technology in any form, and no fire under any circumstances. The cadets were to survive for 3 full rotations using only what the moon itself provided. For most species, this was equivalent to a controlled starvation test because the vegetation of Orthus 9 was notoriously tough, fibrous, and chemically resistant to digestion unless properly processed. The aliens immediately began whispering to one another in panicked clicks and hums, imagining the bitter leaves, the sharp-edged plants, and the fungal bulbs that could never be consumed raw. But in the center of the clearing, Maya Torres simply stood with her hands behind her back, listening in stillness that looked almost serene. She had known the instructors would eventually escalate the difficulty. Every training cycle pushed further toward extremes, and every time the humans refused to break. She suspected that this new rule set was designed specifically to strip her of the one advantage her kind always demonstrated: resourcefulness when armed with even the simplest tools. Yet Maya understood immediately that the restriction was not the true obstacle. The real challenge was the alien cadets' disbelief that food could be prepared without cutting, boiling, burning, scraping, or grinding. Her species had learned to survive long before metallurgy and long before agriculture. She knew that the world itself could cook if someone understood how to use it. The terrain of Orthus 9 was damp and cool, with a constant layer of moisture that condensed on every surface. The soil was dense with microorganisms that thrived in the humidity. To the alien cadets, this environment looked poisonous and dangerous. To Maya, it looked alive, active, and potentially useful. She knew that moisture, heat from decomposition, and time could transform food as effectively as flame. While the others shuddered at the idea of consuming anything raw, she examined the ground with the same curiosity a scientist would use when observing a new culture under a microscope. The instructors ordered each cadet to claim a section of territory. Most aliens immediately searched for large leaves to use as makeshift coverings or attempted to break sticks into crude spears, even though such attempts were technically forbidden. A scolding voice reminded them that snapping or shaping anything into a tool would be counted as a violation. Several cadets froze, unsure what to do next. The absence of any permitted method of food preparation felt like a slow-motion death sentence. Some species could digest almost nothing without heating or mechanical alteration. Others relied on chemical treatments impossible to reproduce here. Fear began spreading among the group, deepening with every passing minute. Maya walked toward a cluster of low trees whose roots twisted above the ground like thick knotted ropes. She crouched beside one of the roots and pressed her hand lightly against the earth. The ground was cool, but not cold. Moist, but not soggy. She could feel subtle vibrations, evidence of the living ecosystem beneath the surface. She brushed aside a layer of moss and exposed a patch of dark soil that released a faint sour scent. It was the smell of fermentation in its earliest stage, the product of microorganisms breaking down organic material. To her, this was a sign of opportunity. She did not need fire or steel. She needed biology, patience, and the right sequence of steps. Before she began gathering anything, she observed the environment the way a chef might study ingredients in a kitchen. She tasted a small drop of moisture from a leaf to test for irritants. She sniffed crushed bark fragments to check for natural antiseptics. She examined fruits for signs of natural sugars. Her senses became her instruments, and she trusted them in a way few cadets could understand. One alien cadet watched her from a distance with wide, fearful eyes, convinced she was poisoning herself. She noticed his stare but did not comment. She knew that the others perceived her behavior as reckless, even dangerous. But she had learned long ago that understanding the land required contact, not avoidance. After completing her initial survey, She began to collect specific items. She gathered fist-sized fruits with translucent skins that bruised easily. She picked thick roots with a starchy interior and snapped them open with her hands, tasting only the faintest trace to determine bitterness. She pulled patches of moss from shaded areas where the moisture smelled sweeter, indicating the presence of benign microbes rather than toxic ones. Each component had a purpose. She was building the foundation for something none of her alien peers had considered: controlled fermentation. She knew that given the right ratios and the right environment, the moon itself would break down the tough fibers, alter flavors, and render the food safe and nutritious without ever needing flame. Some cadets followed her movements with confusion, believing she was simply gathering random debris. One instructor even approached her, observing her with an expression that resembled disbelief. But Maya remained calm. She understood the rules thoroughly. She was not shaping tools, nor was she using technology. She was using natural processes older than civilization itself. She knew that if she buried the crushed fruits with certain mosses and allowed the microorganisms in the soil to work, the mixture would undergo natural transformation. The moisture and ambient temperature would activate bacteria that broke down starches and fibers. In essence, the earth would cook for her. She continued her silent work while the panic among the alien cadets grew louder. Several species attempted to chew raw roots, only to spit them out in disgust. Others tried peeling tough plant skins with their claws, injuring themselves in the process. Maya watched only briefly, feeling a quiet sympathy, but not offering advice yet. She knew that if she intervened too soon, the cadets would dismiss her methods as human eccentricity rather than viable survival strategy. She needed results first. Only then would they listen. As she finished collecting ingredients, she chose a shaded spot where the trees curved overhead, forming a natural shelter that captured humidity. She dug shallow pits with her hands, not deep enough to count as tool-making but sufficient for her purpose. She placed crushed fruit, shredded root fibers, and soft moss into each pit, mixing them gently with the soil. She added small amounts of moisture from nearby leaves, then covered the pits loosely with bark. To an untrained eye, it looked like aimless burying of waste. To her, it was the beginning of a biochemical transformation that would change the entire trajectory of the trial. When she stepped back from her work, the sunlight filtered through the fog in soft beams, catching drops of moisture on her hands. She felt a steady confidence in her chest. The others assumed she had given up food entirely. Some whispered that she was hiding panic beneath a blank expression. But she knew better. She knew that the same microbial forces that terrified the aliens would serve her as allies. Fire might have been forbidden, but chemical heat was not. Tools were banned, but the enzymatic activity within each plant was not. Technology was prohibited, but nature itself was the oldest technology humanity had ever used. Maya settled against a tree and folded her arms, letting her mind quiet. She had begun the slow process of preparing her first meal. Instructors believed this trial would strip every cadet of control and reduce them to raw survival instinct. But she felt none of the desperation that hovered over the rest of the group. She trusted time, chemistry, and patience. She understood that cooking did not always require flame. Sometimes the world did the work on its own. And as the sun climbed higher through the mist, she knew that her silent preparation had already placed her far ahead of every other cadet on Orthus 9. When the instructors dismissed the cadets to begin the trial, the silver fog had already lifted high enough for thin rays of pale sunlight to hit the forest floor. The alien cadets separated reluctantly into their designated areas, each assigned a small section of terrain to prevent cooperation. Maya walked deeper into her zone, moving slowly so she could keep observing the ground, the vegetation, and the small animal tracks pressed into the moisture. She held her hands behind her lower back, fingers laced together, giving the impression of a calm scout rather than a desperate participant in a starvation test. She needed to form a plan quickly because the first hours always mattered most in a no-fire environment. The sooner she assessed her food sources, the sooner she could begin the transformation process she had silently committed to creating. The vegetation grew thicker the farther she moved from the gathering point. The thin trees twisted upward like spiraling pillars, their branches covered with broad leaves that collected dew. She paused beneath one of the tallest trees and reached up to press her palm against the trunk. She closed her eyes and inhaled the scent of the bark. It carried a faint sweetness that suggested the tree stored natural sap, something that could serve as both nourishment and a fermentation catalyst. She did not attempt to cut into it. Her hands were far too soft for that, but she noted the tree species carefully, memorizing the shape of its leaves and the pattern of its roots. She needed to know which parts of her zone contained the most potential ingredients. A small patch of dense shrubbery caught her attention as she continued walking. She crouched and pushed aside the leaves to reveal a cluster of round fruits tucked against the base of a fallen log. The fruits glowed faintly with a pale blue sheen, a visual trick caused by the moon's bioluminescent spores drifting in the air. She picked one up and rolled it between her fingers. Its skin was thinner than the fruits she collected earlier, and she could feel a delicate softness beneath the surface. She brought it to her nose and inhaled. The scent was earthy with a trace of sourness, similar to half-fermented berries from Earth. She pressed her thumb lightly into it and watched the skin split open. A clear liquid beaded at the surface and slowly trickled down her thumb. She tasted only the tiniest drop on the tip of her tongue, just enough to test acidity and potential toxins. It was sharp, but not dangerous. She allowed herself a small, satisfied exhale. This fruit possessed the exact kind of sugar content she needed. She gathered several of the fruits and tucked them gently under her arm before standing again. Each fruit was a building block, a source of sugar that microorganisms could break down into acids and alcohols. Without fire or tools, she needed the environment to do the work of cooking, softening, and transforming. She continued to move through her zone with that same deliberate pace, scanning the ground for roots and scanning the branches for fungi. The air smelled of moisture and decomposition, the perfect combination for microbial life. She knew that if she combined the fruits with the right roots and the right strains of moss, she could initiate natural fermentation without needing any vessel beyond bark and soil. Near a shallow ravine, she discovered another potential ingredient, a cluster of purple-tinted stalks with thick, knotted nodes. She knelt and snapped one open with her hands. The interior was firm but less fibrous than the tough roots she found earlier. The scent that rose from the broken stalk was mild, and when she tasted a tiny piece, she detected a starch-like blandness that reminded her faintly of unprocessed tubers from Earth. She gathered several pieces, brushing off soil as she worked. These stalks were perfect for blending into her fermentation mixture. She imagined the soft, tangy result that would emerge after a full day of microbial activity. It would not be delicious, but it would be edible, and that alone separated survival from collapse. Once she had collected enough fruits and stalks, she looked for the final component she needed, a reliable microbial culture. Moss was abundant on Orthus 9, but not all moss carried the right types of microorganisms. She stepped into a shaded hollow where damp air clung tightly to the ground. Moss covered nearly every surface, forming soft carpets along tree trunks, stones, and fallen branches. She sat on her heels and dug her fingers into the thickest patch. The moss was cool, and as she lifted it, the underside revealed a dark, almost black soil that smelled strongly of natural fermentation. She did not need to taste this mixture. The scent alone confirmed she had found the type of microorganism-rich environment she needed. She separated the moss carefully, keeping it intact so the delicate organisms inside it would continue functioning. With her ingredients gathered, she made her way back to the cluster of shallow pits she dug earlier. The pits looked unremarkable, nothing more than small indentations covered with bark and leaves. She lifted the bark on the first pit and examined the mixture inside. The fruits and roots she placed earlier had already begun releasing moisture. She combined them with the new fruits she had collected, squeezing them with her fingers to rupture their skins and release their juices. She mashed the stalks into long, fibrous strands before folding them into the mixture. Once everything was combined, she added generous handfuls of the moss she collected, layering it gently across the top of the mixture like a blanket. She understood exactly what she was doing. The moss would introduce a dense population of microbes that fed on sugars. The fruits would provide the sugars themselves. The roots and stalks would offer structure and additional nutrients. The soil beneath the mixture would regulate temperature and humidity, allowing the microorganisms to multiply. And the bark she placed over the pit would protect the mixture from insects without cutting off airflow. She pressed the bark down gently and repeated the process with the remaining pits. Her hands grew sticky with fruit juice and soil, but she barely noticed. She was building an entire meal using nothing but chemistry and instinct. When she finished, she washed her hands in a small stream that ran through the edge of her zone. The water was cold enough to numb her fingertips, but she kept her hands submerged until the last trace of juice had been washed away. As she stood and dried her hands on her trousers, she observed the movement of the alien cadets around her. Several attempted to gnaw the edges of tough roots, only to spit out pieces that refused to break apart. Others picked bitter leaves and chewed slowly, grimacing with every bite. A few paced frantically, jumping from ingredient to ingredient with no strategy, hoping to find something edible by luck alone. The instructors watched from elevated platforms, recording reactions and behaviors, clearly waiting for signs of panic. Maya felt none of that panic. She had finished the hardest part of her strategy. Now she needed only to wait for the microbial processes to begin working beneath the soil. She sat beneath a sweeping branch, leaning her back against the trunk. She felt the vibration of the tree behind her, not a sound, but a subtle resonance produced by the movement of sap. It reminded her of earth forests, where trees also communicated through quiet currents. She closed her eyes and allowed her breathing to settle into an even rhythm. There would be challenges ahead. She expected hunger, cold, and the emotional pressure of watching others struggle. But the foundation of her plan was already in motion. She trusted the natural processes she had initiated because she understood them deeply. The alien cadets believed the trial was an impossible scenario, a cruel test designed to break even the strongest species. But she saw it differently. She saw a moon filled with living organisms ready to collaborate with her. She saw a kitchen without walls, where fire had never been necessary. And as the sunlight dimmed into the soft lavender of Orthus 9's afternoon, she felt a quiet confidence settle over her. She would not starve. She had already taken the first deliberate step toward transforming raw wilderness into nourishment. The trial had barely begun, yet her strategy was already unfolding smoothly, as if the land itself understood her intentions and agreed to help. The first night on Orthus 9 passed slowly, wrapped in silence broken only by the soft chittering of small nocturnal creatures moving through the underbrush. Maya woke at the first hint of indigo light rising over the horizon, long before any alien cadet stirred. The humid air clung to her skin, and the scent of damp soil intensified with the approaching dawn. She sat up, brushed the moss from her clothes, and took several deep breaths, steadying her mind before the day's work. This morning mattered. She needed to evaluate what the night had done to her buried mixtures. She felt an edge of anticipation that almost resembled excitement, though she kept her expression still and practical. Hope was a luxury she avoided until she saw proof. She approached the first pit with patient steps, careful not to disturb the delicate soil layers. The bark covering the mixture was cool to the touch and beaded with moisture. She lifted it slowly, expecting only the earliest signs of change. But as soon as the bark shifted, a faint but unmistakable aroma escaped from the pit, a tangy, acidic scent that hit her like a reward. A smile flickered across her face, the first genuine smile she allowed herself since the trial began. The chemical process had started faster than she anticipated. The combination of sugars, Microbes and humidity had created a perfect environment for fermentation during the night's stable temperatures. The mixture inside the pit looked different from the scattered ingredients she had assembled the day before. The fruits had softened noticeably, their skins collapsing inward as the microorganisms consumed the sugars. The root fibers had absorbed moisture and lost some of their harsh rigidity. The moss layer, once bright green, now appeared darker, almost melted into the mixture as the microbes within it spread and multiplied. Maya leaned closer and inhaled deeply. The scent had layers: sourness from lactic acid, sweetness from the fruit, and an earthy undertone from the decomposing plant matter. It reminded her faintly of the fermentation pits used by certain earth tribes who preserved food without fire. That familiar echo gave her confidence that she was on the right path. She dipped her fingers into the mixture and gently lifted a small amount. The texture was softer, with strands of root breaking apart under the slightest pressure. She tasted only a small piece, letting it rest on her tongue long enough to judge acidity, bitterness, and potential toxins. The flavor was sharp but tolerable, entirely safe based on her assessment. She swallowed it slowly and exhaled through her nose. The microorganisms had done their work. The mixture was not only edible, it was nutritious. A small, satisfied warmth spread through her chest. She had found her foothold. She continued to uncover the remaining pits, each one revealing its own stage of transformation. Some mixtures fermented more aggressively, producing a stronger sour aroma. Others remained relatively mild. She made mental notes of which ingredients produced which results, adjusting her understanding of Orthus 9's micro-ecosystem with every observation. She was not simply preparing food. She was learning the moon's biological language. The moisture, the soil composition, the bacterial strains, the fruit's sugar content, all of it came together to form a natural chemistry laboratory. She felt at home inside that logic. As she worked, faint sounds reached her from nearby zones. Groans of hunger, frustrated clicking, the scraping of claws against plants too tough to break apart. She did not turn toward the noise. She had already decided that she would offer help only after she had confirmed that her food was safe and stable. She needed strength before she could offer any, and she refused to risk collapsing from hunger out of misplaced sympathy. She scooped a portion of the softened mixture into her hands and ate carefully, measuring every bite. The fermented mash was not pleasant, but it energized her quickly. Warmth spread from her stomach outward as her body absorbed the glucose and organic acids. She felt sharper, steadier, more alert. She wiped her hands on her trousers and covered the pits again, allowing the remaining mixtures to continue improving. Satisfied with the first stage, she moved on to experimenting with a new preparation. She selected several strips of fibrous plant material she had collected earlier, long, flexible bark strands and stalk fibers that could not be chewed raw. She laid them across a large, flat leaf and squeezed fermented liquid from one of the pits onto the fibers. The acidic juice coated the plant strips, soaking into the rigid fibers. She folded the leaf over the mixture, pressing lightly to ensure the liquid spread evenly. Her goal was simple: acid-based tenderizing. If the fibers softened enough, she could create thin, chewable strips resembling cold-cooked noodles or plant jerky. She set the wrapped leaf aside and weighted it with a smooth stone. Her next task was to refine the flavor and nutritional profile of the mixture. She walked deeper into her zone, searching for edible spores she had noticed earlier on a slanted tree trunk with ridged bark. The spores formed pale yellow clusters, arranged in patterns that resembled delicate handprints. She touched them lightly and felt the powdery texture. She knew some fungal spores could be toxic, but her earlier test showed these particular spores were mild and contained protein structures compatible with human digestion. She scraped them carefully with her fingernails and added them to a pile in her palm. Once she gathered enough, she carried them back to her fermentation pits and sprinkled them into one of the newer mixtures. The spores would not ferment, but they would bind with the acids and form a protein-rich paste, improving the nutritional value of her food. She pressed them gently into the mixture and covered it again. As the sun climbed higher, the alien cadets began wandering through their zones with increasing desperation. One cadet, a reptilian female with a crest of glistening frills, collapsed onto a rock and pressed her hands against her stomach. Maya watched from a distance, her face unreadable. She recognized the symptoms of low blood sugar: trembling limbs, shallow breaths, unfocused eyes. If the cadet continued refusing food, she would collapse entirely by evening. Maya stood, brushing soil from her knees, and considered approaching her. But she hesitated. It was not time yet. The fermented mixture still needed a few more hours to strengthen its flavor profile and break down the remaining plant fibers. Maya could not risk exposing her methods prematurely, especially when some cadets might react with suspicion or hostility. She would wait until the next stage was complete. She returned to the leaf bundle she prepared earlier and unwrapped it carefully. The fibers had changed texture dramatically. The acidic liquid had broken down the outer layers, leaving the strips pliable and soft. When she pulled one apart, it separated cleanly, no longer resisting. She tasted a small section and nodded with satisfaction. The fiber tasted slightly sour but edible, with a consistency similar to a raw vegetable marinated overnight. She wrapped more fibers in fermented liquid and set them aside. She already imagined creating a layered meal: fermented mash, softened fiber strips, and fungal spore paste. A three-component cold-cooked dish prepared without tools, heat, or anything resembling conventional food processing. She almost laughed at the absurdity of how easy it felt to her. Once she confirmed the stability of her mixtures, she gathered several long leaves from a plant with smooth, flexible blades. She shaped them gently into bowl-like forms, folding the edges inward and securing them with pressure alone. She placed portions of fermented mash inside the makeshift bowls and arranged softened fiber strips across the top. She held one bowl in her hands and took several slow bites. Her hunger eased, and the clarity of her thoughts sharpened instantly. She felt strength returning to her muscles, and the dull ache in her joints faded. The moon's natural biochemistry had become her partner. By midday, the alien cadets' condition worsened. Their steps slowed, their voices cracked when they spoke, and some turned their heads sharply whenever they heard the rustle of foliage, as if hoping an edible creature might appear. One cadet attempted to swallow whole chunks of unprocessed plant material, only to gag and stumble forward. Another sat on the ground and buried his face in his hands. Hunger transformed training exercises into psychological battles. Maya watched quietly, understanding how dangerous the next hours could become if someone made a rash decision. She stood and walked slowly toward the boundary of her zone, holding one of her leaf bowls in both hands. She did not speak, but her posture made her intention clear. The reptilian cadet with the trembling limbs looked up at her with hollow eyes. Maya extended the leaf bowl and waited. The cadet hesitated, sniffing the air with suspicion, but hunger overpowered caution. She took the bowl with a shaking hand and brought it to her mouth. She tasted the fermented mixture, flinching at the sourness. But the moment the nutrients hit her bloodstream, her expression changed instantly. Relief softened her features. Her frills lowered. Her breath steadied. Maya observed her carefully, watching for any signs of allergic reactions or digestive distress. When none appeared, she nodded once, satisfied. The food was safe for at least one alien species. That meant her cold cooking method was viable across species barriers, or at least broadly tolerable. She felt the quiet thrill of accomplishment, but she did not show it. She simply turned and walked back toward her pits, ready to prepare the next batch. The cold cooking process had officially begun, not just for her but for anyone desperate enough to try her alien Earth hybrid cuisine. The instructors watching from above did not intervene yet, but she could feel their eyes on her, eyes filled with bewilderment and a growing awareness that the human cadet was not slowing down. She was accelerating, turning forbiddance into innovation. And as the day stretched into a glowing amber afternoon, She prepared for the next transformation, fully aware that her quiet work had just altered the trajectory of the entire trial. Maya returned to her pits with long, steady strides, intent on strengthening the next batches before the afternoon heat peaked. The reptilian cadet's reaction had confirmed two important things. The food was safe, and her method could stabilize others before exhaustion pushed them past the point of rational decision-making. She removed the bark from the newest pit, inspecting the mixture with sharpened focus. More bubbles had formed on the surface, tiny pockets of carbon dioxide released by the active microbes. That meant the fermentation was accelerating in exactly the way she hoped. She stirred it lightly with her fingers, observing how the roots separated into softer strands. The earthy, sour aroma rose sharply, making her inhale with the practiced calm of someone long accustomed to strong scents. As the mixture continued transforming, she decided to expand her experiments. She needed not only edible food, but also stable nourishment that would not spoil quickly. Fermentation preserved food by creating an acidic environment hostile to dangerous organisms. If she could push the acidity to the right level, she could create a long-lasting supply for the next rotations. She dug a shallow trench and placed several layers of broad leaves inside it. She then transferred portions of the most advanced mixture into the trench, smoothing the surface with her palms. Once the base layer settled, she crushed more stalk fibers between smooth stones she found nearby. She did not shape the stones into tools. She simply used their natural weight to apply pressure. The stalks released a cloudy liquid with a faint mineral taste. She poured this liquid over the trench mixture, letting it seep into every corner. The added moisture would encourage deeper fermentation. When she rose again, she saw movement near the boundary of her zone. The reptilian cadet had regained enough strength to stand. She watched Maya with wide, curious eyes, her frills fluttering with cautious gratitude. Maya acknowledged her with a small nod but said nothing. The cadet lingered for several seconds before turning away to follow the scent trails of the forest, renewed energy visible in every step. This moment marked a shift in the trial. The other cadets would soon notice the difference. One cadet gaining strength could be dismissed as luck, but two or three. That would challenge the very logic of the survival exercise. The sun climbed to its highest point, painting the landscape in warm, pale gold. The humid air intensified, making the scents of the forest stronger and more complex. Maya recognized this temperature spike as an opportunity. Warmer air sped up fermentation if the moisture remained stable. She gathered more fruits from her earlier collection site, seeking ones with the highest sugar concentration. She tested each fruit by pressing it lightly until the juice seeped through the skin. She tasted the droplets, feeling the tang on her tongue. When she found the sweetest fruits, she carried them back in the fold of her shirt. She crushed the fruits directly into one of the newer pits, letting the juices flow over the fibers. The sweetness would feed the microbes, pushing the fermentation toward an even richer, more potent blend. She added moss and pressed it gently, feeling the soil beneath warm slightly from microbial activity. She paused, allowing her fingers to rest on the mixture. The heat was faint, but unmistakable, the chemical equivalent of low fire. She felt a quiet satisfaction. She had built a biological oven. A weak groan sounded from the far end of her assigned area. Maya lifted her head and saw an avian cadet sitting against a tree trunk. He was small, slender, and covered in iridescent feathers that drooped heavily. His breathing was shallow, and his trembling hands clutched a handful of unprocessed roots that offered no nourishment. His eyes looked unfocused, as if he had slipped into the early stages of delirium. Maya knew the signs. She approached him slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. She knelt in front of him and placed a leaf bowl beside his hand. The cadet blinked at the bowl, staring as if unsure whether the contents were real. Maya gently lifted his hand and guided it toward the fermented mash. His fingers brushed the soft mixture. He hesitated, fear flickering across his expression. But then hunger took over. He scooped a small amount and brought it to his mouth. His eyes widened at the sour taste, but he continued eating, swallowing slowly at first, then with growing urgency as his body recognized the nutrients. His breath steadied. His feathers tightened. He lowered his head in a silent gesture of gratitude. Maya placed another bowl beside him before walking away, trusting him to continue eating without her supervision. She returned to her pits and resumed working, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she portioned out more servings. She did not indulge in pride, but she allowed herself one silent acknowledgement. She had crossed a threshold. She was no longer the only cadet with a plan. She had become a source of stability in a test designed to isolate every participant. As she prepared the bowls, more cadets appeared at the edges of her zone. First one, then two, then a small group. Their movements were slow, cautious, but filled with unmistakable desperation. Some glanced at her with suspicion, unsure whether a human's food could harm them. Others stared at the leaf bowls in her hands with painful longing. Maya met their eyes one by one. She did not speak, but she gestured with calm confidence toward the prepared food. One by one, they stepped closer. The first to approach was a tall insectoid cadet with chitin plates layered across her arms. She reached for the bowl but paused, lowering her mandibles uncertainly. Maya took a small portion of the fermented mash from her own bowl and ate it in front of her, showing no hesitation. This simple gesture dissolved the cadet's fear. She dipped her clawed fingers into the bowl and tasted the mixture. Her mandibles clicked with surprise, then softened into relief as she swallowed. She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of respect in her species. The next cadet approached, a mammalian male with a broad chest and fur that lost its sheen from hunger. He accepted the bowl from Maya but sniffed it carefully, his species' natural caution showing through. Maya waited patiently. When he finally tasted the mash, his tightly folded ears lifted, and his posture straightened. She observed him closely, making sure the food settled well. When he finished half the bowl without issue, she relaxed. A third cadet stepped forward, a slender amphibian female who had lost nearly all strength in her limbs. Maya handed her a smaller portion first, knowing her species digested food differently. The cadet ate slowly, blinking as if surprised by each bite. When she finished the first serving without distress, Maya gave her a larger one. By the time the amphibian cadet finished, the dullness in her eyes had faded, and she stood more firmly on her feet. The group continued to grow. Hunger had stripped away pride. Cadets who rarely spoke during training now approached silently, drawn by the scent of the fermentation pits. Maya moved among them like a quiet conductor, distributing bowls, offering small corrections, adjusting portions based on species size and digestion patterns. She understood that sharing her methods openly would invite chaos, but sharing food was manageable, controlled, and essential. As the sun began to descend into a glowing orange haze, the entire atmosphere of the trial shifted. The desperation that had filled the air only hours earlier faded into cautious hope. The cadets sat in small clusters, each of them eating from crafted leaf bowls, watching Maya with expressions ranging from admiration to disbelief. Some whispered among themselves, pointing toward the pits she tended like a gardener tending soil. From the elevated platforms, the instructors watched without interfering. Their postures remained rigid, their eyes unblinking. They had expected collapse, panic, and eventual withdrawals. Instead, they witnessed cooperation formed around a single human who had crafted nourishment from nothing but soil, fruit, and time. Maya felt their attention, but did not acknowledge it. Her focus remained on the pits, the mixtures, and the cadets, who now relied on her work. As twilight settled over Orthus 9, she rested beside her newest fermentation trench. She listened to the low hum of microbial activity beneath the soil, the soft murmurs of recovering cadets, and the rustling of nocturnal creatures emerging for the night. She felt no triumph, no arrogance, only the clear, steady conviction that she had turned the trial's impossible restrictions into a functional system of survival. Cold cooking was no longer a personal experiment. It had become a lifeline shared among species who once doubted her understanding of the land. And as she prepared her next batch under the violet sky, she understood that tomorrow would bring an even greater test, not of hunger, but of leadership. The second night on Orthis 9 settled in a deep violet hue, leaving long shadows stretching across the forest floor. The cadets who had eaten from Maya's pits rested in scattered clusters, their breathing steadier, their limbs no longer trembling from hunger. A calm silence spread across the trial grounds, a silence that did not exist the night before. Maya sat with her back against a wide root system, listening to the subtle sounds of microbial activity beneath the soil. The faint warmth radiating from the fermentation trench reassured her that her cold cooking system would continue through the night. She knew that tomorrow would not be about stabilizing the cadets. It would be about proving to the instructors that her method was not luck, but a controlled, replicable process built on biological logic. When dawn returned, it arrived without panic. Cadets stirred slowly, not with fear, but with almost reverent expectation. Some walked to the edges of Maya's zone and paused, unsure whether they were permitted to approach further. She rose before speaking to any of them. The morning air was cooler than she expected, which could slow fermentation if she did not adjust her pits. She crouched beside the trench and removed the bark cover. A rich, layered aroma escaped, sour, earthy, faintly sweet. She dipped her fingers into the mixture and felt the new texture. The fermentation had deepened during the night, thickening the mash into a creamy paste. The acidity was stronger, precisely where she wanted it. She tasted a small portion, analyzing the way it settled on her tongue. She smiled slightly. It was perfect. The cadets gathered around her slowly. No one dared to speak first, but their eyes betrayed a mixture of curiosity and dependence. Maya distributed small servings, ensuring the first to receive food were those with the weakest energy reserves. The amphibian female accepted her bowl with a bow of gratitude. The reptilian cadet stepped forward afterward, her frills lifted in a quiet salute. The mammalian male approached last, inhaling the scent with genuine admiration. She nodded to them once, acknowledging their progress. She understood that each of them now carried a piece of the method within their bodies. The food was not just sustenance, but proof of transformation. When every cadet finished eating, the instructors finally descended from the platforms. 3 of them approached. The central instructor, an insectoid male with a ridged crest, a tall avian instructor whose feathers shimmered like polished steel, and a smaller reptilian instructor with dark stripes across his face. Their expressions were unreadable, carved into disciplined stillness by years of military training. Yet their eyes revealed confusion and something close to disbelief. The insectoid instructor stopped before Maya. His mandibles twitched slightly as he observed the pits behind her, the bowls in the cadets' hands, and the renewed strength visible in their posture. He seemed to struggle for several seconds before speaking. "Explain," he commanded. Maya stood without hesitation. She met his gaze with calm confidence and gestured toward the nearest pit. "Fermentation," she said. "Sugar-rich fruits. Microbial cultures from the soil. Controlled acidity. No tools. No fire." The avian instructor tilted his head sharply, clearly taken aback by the simplicity of her explanation. The reptilian instructor stepped closer to examine the mixture, inhaling carefully before pulling back with wide, startled eyes. The insectoid instructor seemed dissatisfied with her brevity. "Demonstrate." She nodded once. She removed the bark from another pit, selected 2 fruits, and crushed them gently between her palms. She mixed the fruit pulp with stalk fibers, showing the instructors the softening effect of the acidic environment. Then she scooped a handful of moss, pointing out how microbial content differed between shaded and exposed areas. She layered the moss onto the mixture and pressed the bark cover over it. "This begins a new batch," she said. "By dusk, the fibers will soften. By nightfall, the acidity will stabilize. By morning, the food will be safe." The avian instructor crouched beside the pit, examining it as if he were studying an alien artifact. "And you did this?" he said, his voice low. "Without tools? Without fire?" "Yes," she replied. "Cold cooking. Biology replaces heat." The insectoid instructor shifted his mandibles again, visibly unsettled. "Your species uses this method commonly?" "No," she answered. "Not commonly. But the principles exist in human history." The instructors exchanged glances, their rigid composure showing the faintest cracks. Mira, the amphibian cadet, watched them with quiet amusement, realizing that the instructors, creatures who prided themselves on understanding every species, were struggling to accept what stood in front of them. The reptilian instructor finally spoke. "Your method stabilized all of them." He gestured toward the cadets with a sweeping motion. "No species collapsed. No one withdrew. No one required extraction." He paused before continuing. "This trial has never produced such results." Maya did not respond to the underlying accusation that she had subverted the instructor's expectations. She simply said, "Hunger was the real threat. I removed it." The insectoid instructor straightened to his full height. "Your solution was not anticipated." His tone wavered slightly. "This trial was designed to nullify human advantages." Maya allowed herself the faintest smile. "Perhaps you misidentified the advantage." Silence fell over the clearing. The cadets watched with a spark of pride in their expressions, recognizing that the instructors were not simply surprised, they were forced to reevaluate the assumptions they carried into every training cycle. Maya sensed the tension, but remained composed. She knew the instructors were not angry. They were confronted with evidence that survival was not a matter of strength or specialized physiology, but understanding and manipulating the environment itself. The insectoid instructor stepped closer. "You did not merely survive," he said. "You created infrastructure." He pointed toward the pits, the trenches, the leaf bowls, and the organized portions. "You built a functional food system." Maya nodded. "The moon provided what was needed." He hesitated. "And you understood what it offered when none of the others did." "It was not their fault," she said. "Different species learn differently. I learned from Earth's history. Not all cooking uses heat. Some uses time." For the first time during the trial, the insectoid instructor's stern expression softened. It lasted only a moment, but the message was clear. He respected her. He stepped back and faced the entire group. "The trial concludes," he announced. "All cadets will return to the transport." A ripple of relief passed through the group, but many cadets glanced at Maya with gratitude that went beyond simple survival. The avian instructor gestured for her to step forward. She obeyed. "You altered the outcome of a test that was meant to break you," he said. "And you did so using nothing but soil and instinct." His wings fluttered as he finished. "This will be recorded." The reptilian instructor bowed his head slightly. "Your method will be studied." The insectoid instructor added, "and possibly taught." But Maya shook her head gently. "Do not teach my method," she said. "Teach the principle. Teach cadets to trust an environment, not fear it." The instructors exchanged glances again. After a long moment, the insectoid instructor spoke softly. "That lesson may be the most valuable one." The group began walking toward the transport, energized and steady after the ordeal. As they moved, the cadets formed a loose circle around Maya, not protective, not deferential, but grateful. She walked among them quietly, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even. She felt no pride, no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction that knowledge, not force, had carried her through the trial. When she stepped onto the transport ramp and the engines hummed to life, she cast one last look at the forest. The pits remained buried beneath bark and moss, still warm from the microbial activity she had nurtured. The moon appeared peaceful now, not hostile, a place that revealed its secrets only to those willing to listen. Maya understood that cold cooking was more than a survival trick. It was proof that even in the harshest conditions, ingenuity could transform restriction into opportunity. And as the transport ascended into the pale sky, leaving Orthus 9 behind, she realized she had created something that would outlast the trial itself. The instructors expected collapse. Instead, she gave them a new discipline,